Rascal Chapter 3, July. Rascal had one virtue rare in human beings, the capacity for gratitude. Feed him a favorite food, say a kind word, and he was your friend. This simple approach to the heart of a raccoon produced some odd friendships in our neighborhood. Rascal's circle included Joe Hanks, the dim-witted janitor of the Methodist Church, who was convinced that the German Lutherans were planning to poison the water supply of Brailsford Junction. "Stands to reason, don't it?" Joe said. "They got the water tower right up there on German Hill behind the Lutheran church. All they gotta do is drop a couple little poison pills down the air vent, and next morning we'll all wake up dead." Joe was otherwise harmless. He pumped the pipe organ when sober and let me pump it when he started getting drunk. His secret for winning Rascal's affection came in his lunchbox. He always gave my raccoon half of one of his jelly sandwiches. Rascal thought Joe was one of the nicest people he had ever met. Another friend was Bumblebee Jim Vandevonder, the bald, 300-pound son of our equally large washerwoman. Jim arrived every Monday morning, pulling a little coaster wagon behind him to pick up our washing, and brought it back on Friday, clean, fresh-smelling, and beautifully ironed. On each arrival, he gave Rascal a peppermint candy. What more could one ask of a friend? Rascal couldn't, of course, read the calendar or the clock, but he knew almost to the minute when Bumblebee Jim was arriving and always became eager and talkative, anticipating his piece of candy. I finally concluded that raccoons, who don't do most of their hunting at night, have an extremely acute sense of hearing. Apparently, Rascal was aware of the first faint rattle of the coaster wagon far off down the street. From all the sounds of summer, the whir of distant lawnmowers, the singing of the cicadas, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, and the orchestration of the birds, Rascal could distinguish and identify, long before I could, the distant approach of the coaster wagon. Not all of Rascal's motives were ulterior. He loved music for its own sake and had definite preferences among the records I played for him on the wind-up Victrola. Wagnerian sopranos hurt his ears, but he would sit dreamy-eyed listening to his favorite popular song, "There's a long, long trail a-windin'." In that ballad, nightingales are mentioned. I asked my father one morning if we have nightingales in America or any other bird that sings at night. "Not nightingales," he said, "but we do have whippoorwills, of course." I had never heard of a whippoorwill. Can that be possible? Why, when I was a boy, and he was off on a pilgrimage into the past when Wisconsin was still half wilderness, when panthers sometimes looked in through the windows and the whippoorwills called all night long. Thur Ludwig Theodor Kumlian, 1819 to 1888, always came into these reminiscences somewhere. He was a great pioneer naturalist, from whom the Kumlian gull, aster, and anemone were named. A contemporary of Thoreau and Audubon and Agassiz, he had been trained at Uppsala in Sweden and had come to southern Wisconsin in the 1840s, buying 80 acres adjoining the North Homestead. Kumlian could start the whippoorwills any night by playing his flute, my father said. Far across the fields we heard them, the old man with his flute, his son playing the violin, and hundreds of whippoorwills calling. That's music to remember. It made me sad that I could not have known Kumlian and walked the woods with him, learning every bird and flower and insect. I had been born too late, it seemed, even to hear a whippoorwill. My father looked at me for a moment as though he were really seeing me. "Let's take the day off," he said. "There must be a pair of whippoorwills somewhere around here." Those were rare and gala days when my father took me rambling. While I slapped together a few cheese sandwiches and packed half a dozen bottles of cold root beer and pop in the lunch basket, my father drove downtown to hang a sign on the office door, "Gone for the day." He came back with the windshield down, the top back, and his white curls blowing in the wind. He was wearing a pair of motor goggles and looked very handsome and dashing, I thought. I put on my goggles too. Rascal, of course, wore his permanently. He perched between us on the back of the seat, gazing rapturously ahead. We had sold the old Model T and now were driving a huge 7-passenger Oldsmobile, which my father had accepted in one of his numerous real estate swaps. It was rather large for the two of us, but we needed that big back seat for the occasion when we took Wowzer with us. The St. Bernard would never lie down in the car. He lumbered from one side to the other, peering forward with worried face and furrowed brow, occasionally woofing a deep-throated warning. But Wowzer couldn't go today. He would frighten too many birds. The three of us were leaving him behind. We were a happy trio as my father pulled down the gas lever and roared from low into second, from second into high. We took the Newville Road, which led towards Lake Koshkonong, one of the largest lakes in Wisconsin, which is formed by a widening in Rock River and deepened by the dam at Indian Ford. In former years, it had been covered in the shallows by hundreds of acres of wild rice, which had attracted thousands of waterfowl and migrating bands of Indians. There were still many flocks of wild ducks and geese each spring and fall, and big pickerel and wall-eyed pike for which we sometimes trolled from a rowboat. We swung upstream from Newville toward Taylor's Point, where an old resort hotel called the Lake House then stood. There were few cottages on Koshkonong in those days, merely groves and meadows and miles of sand beaches. Several creeks entered shallow bays where great blue herons waded stealthily, striking as swiftly as a water snake to seize and swallow small fish and frogs. We took the Lake House Road and followed a grassy lane to the limestone cliff jutting into the lake. A promontory crowned with white clover and shaded by magnificent old trees. My father set the emergency brake, and I chalked the wheels with large stones to be sure that the Oldsmobile would not bounce from that 75-foot precipice into the lake. Then all three of us went running out to the very tip of the point as though we were a little mad with happiness, as indeed we were. This was our very own lake, filling our life to the brim. We had each been born almost within the sound of its waves. Here we had spent our separate boyhoods. Here we fished and swam and canoed and searched for arrowheads. The view from the point was superb. We could see the outlet of the lake into Rock River, downstream to our right, and 10 miles away to our left, the inlet in the blue haze. My father's memories and mine differed, of course, for he had known these shores when they were heavily forested, and he had visited the Indian wigwams on Crabapple Point, to Tybalt's Point, and Charlie's Bluff. And at the age of 12, he had fallen slightly in love with a pretty Indian girl, so light-skinned and delicate of feature that my father was sure she was more than half French. The Indians had moved on, like the waterfowl they hunted, and with them went the girl, whom he never saw again. Most prominent of all the points was a dark, lush projection, which was the delta made by Koshkonong Creek, perhaps the wildest bit of woods and water in the entire region. I had been careless in supervising Rascal, and I looked just in time to see him disappearing down a crooked ravine that angled through the limestone towards the lake. It was a moist and pleasant cleft in the rock with wild columbine blooming from every crevice, and it led by a devious and dangerous route to a little cave named for the Indian chief Black Hawk. Rascal was only exploring, but I feared the small raccoon might take a dangerous tumble at the edge of the precipice. "I'm going after him," I shouted to my father. "Well, be careful, son," he said. He was a casual parent who never tried to stop me from risking any hazard, even when I swam through the floodgates at Indian Ford. He knew I could climb like a squirrel and swim like an otter, so he had no worries about me. The little ravine nicked into the cliff was steep and slippery, but the chase was swift, for there, well ahead of me, was the ringtail disappearing around one turn after another. "Come back here, Rascal," I shouted sternly, but the raccoon paid no attention. I pulled a sugar lump from my pocket, usually a successful resource, but Rascal was having none of it. He did not hesitate a moment until he reached the sheer cliff with a 20-foot drop to the cave's entrance, toward which he peered down eagerly. I trilled in our mutual language, and he responded, but over he went, scrambling backward down the wall of the rock. I reached the edge a moment too late to stop him, and I could only hold my breath until he arrived safely at the cave. There was nothing for it now but to inch my own way down the last 20 feet, catching a toe hold or finger hold wherever possible between the strata of limestone. In a few minutes, however, I too was safely at the entrance, which offered crawl space to the inner room. It wasn't a large cave, but by tradition it had furnished Black Hawk a hiding place while he was being pursued by Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, and other young soldiers during the Black Hawk War. The episode was probably a myth, but the boys of that area who scrambled down to the small cavern believed every word of the story and shuddered to think that the ghost of Black Hawk might be lurking there in the gloom. The sandy floor of this cool hideaway was large enough for a small campfire and 2 or 3 campers, and there was a convenient ledge 4 feet above the floor, which furnished sleeping space for an uncomfortable night wrapped in blankets. When my eyes grew accustomed to the dim light, I saw Rascal. He was prowling along the shelf of rock, trying to reach the tiny, gleaming stalactites which hung from the low roof of the cave. He was reaching up with his eager little hands when I caught him. I had no desire to punish him. I merely held him close. And Rascal told me in every way he could that I was completely forgiven for having cornered and captured him. My father greeted us as we came safely up the cliff. He had been certain that I would rescue the raccoon and then would survive the climb. Living much in the past and never in the worrisome future, his outlook was so tranquil, and he drifted pleasantly from 1862 to 1962, 7 months short of a full century, with very little sense of personal or international tragedy. Curiously enough, this lifelong detachment accompanied an excellent university education, a vast store of disorganized knowledge, and a certain amount of charm. "Whippoorwills," he exclaimed, "are seldom seen in the daylight. They crouch on fenced rails or the limbs of trees. If they flutter up for a moment, they resemble giant Caropia moths. We won't find them until after dusk, and that gives us many hours. With the whole day ahead of us, we took our swinging trunks and the lunch basket and started down the long sloping path to the beach. My father was the acknowledged expert on the Indian trails of southern Wisconsin. This was a Fox Winnebago sack trail, my father said. It was used by Black Hawk and his warriors and by their pursuers. These large burial mounds were probably made by much earlier tribes. Along these trails were to be found bird points, hunting arrows, skinning knives, and scrapers, mostly of flint. In my father's fine collection, there were also black and gleaming obsidian spear points, some of them 8 inches long, red calumets transported from Minnesota, and copper ornaments from the Lake Superior region. As we progressed downward toward the beach, Rascal trundled along obediently, panting in the manner of dogs and raccoons when they are hot. The sight of glistening water ahead, cool and inviting, increased his gait to a gallop. I paused to examine his tracks, which made a design like beadwork on an Indian quiver. The handprints and footprints resembled those of a very small human baby. Where Rascal had been walking, the imprint of the retreating left hand was paired with that of the advancing right foot, and vice versa. But where he had broken into a gallop, all 4 tracks tended to bunch. For all his intelligent adaptability, my small friend was aided in every act by intricate and inborn patterns of raccoon behavior. On this curve of the shore, a very cold, spring-fed rivulet rushed down from the hills, twisting among glacial boulders and the roots of oak trees to fan across the white sand to the lake. In a pool of this stream, I placed the bottles of root beer and pop awaiting our picnic. My father and I donned swimming trunks, and soon all 3 of us were in the lake. Sandpipers tipped and scurried along the beach, darting in and out of the waves, as the waves advanced or retreated. Rails slithered through the reeds, and somewhere, safely hidden, an American bittern began to pump his odd, deep note like the sound of a sledgehammer driving a fence post into marshy soil. My father was a strong swimmer, using the old-fashioned breaststroke. I was very proud of the fact that I had learned the fast, effective Australian crawl, but Rascal could only dog paddle. He came along bravely, however, keeping his nose out of the water, indicating again that raccoons probably can't dive. For a 3-month-old, he was doing excellently, but soon he was panting from the exertion and looking to me as his natural protector. We were in deep water now, and the best I could do for him was to roll over on my back in a floating position, arch my chest, and offer him a good platform. He scrambled gratefully aboard, whimpering slightly in self-pity. But soon he had regained his courage and his breath, and in he plunged again. I had thought that Rascal had demonstrated his top speed, but as we came around a grassy point, I learned my error. There, too, to her surprise and ours, was the modest mate of the glamorous mallard drake, garbed in becoming brown and leading a late nesting of downy ducklings. This mallard mother had 11 beautiful babies, light as thistledown, following her for dear life in a straight line flotilla. Rascal accelerated by at least 10% upon seeing the tempting sight ahead. He obviously had visions of a juicy duckling dinner. I wanted to forestall this slaughter, but my father said quietly, "Wait a minute, son, and watch what happens." The ducklings performed a marvelous maneuver around the mother duck while she turned back to face the intruder. Putting herself between her endangered brood and Rascal, she swam directly toward the raccoon with no more fear than as thought he had been a muskrat. On came my crazy pet, on came the determined mother duck. It seemed a duel to the death, or at least a head-on collision. At the last possible moment, the mallard used her wings and was partially airborne. She aimed one strong and accurate blow of her bill between Rascal's avid eyes, flew over his head, and wheeled to join her ducklings. Rascal wasn't actually hurt, but his pride was wounded. He swam back to me, talking about it sorrowfully, and I gave him another rest after his shattering experience. In a few minutes, he began to pretend he had forgotten all about that duckling dinner, and soon we went ashore for other food. Raccoons have a passion for turtle eggs and search for them on every beach. The turtles bury their eggs in the sand to let them be hatched by the warmth of the sun. But many a nest of eggs becomes a banquet for a raccoon. Rascal had never been told about turtle eggs, but his keen nostrils informed him that somewhere in this sand was a gastronomic delight he had never sampled. For at least 3 seconds he froze in the manner of a bird dog coming to a point. Then he began digging more furiously than he had ever dug before. Success! Up they came, all 34 of them, almost as big as golf balls, meaning that they were the eggs of a big, snapping turtle. For the next half hour, Rascal was with us physically, but elsewhere in spirit, obviously in some realm where gourmet raccoons feast for eternity, their eyes on the stars, while their swift hands and sharp little teeth tear open turtle eggs to gorge upon them. While we ate our picnic lunch, Rascal was busy slightly depleting the next generation of snapping turtles. He was so completely satiated that he even refused the last few sips of my strawberry pop. The sun was past the meridian, but there were many summer hours to squander before we might hear the first evening whippoorwill. My father, who owned farms in this region, decided we might as well visit them to see how the tobacco was leafing out and how the wheat harvest was progressing. It should be said in passing that ownership of a piece of property was never that simple with my father. Although he never touched a card, he was a born gambler, particularly in real estate. When he took title to a farm, he immediately loaded it with a first mortgage and usually a second mortgage. With the money thus liberated, he would buy another farm and repeat the process. It was very much like buying securities on a margin. When the market was rising, he pyramided his paper profits, but in every farm recession, he came close to disaster. I didn't understand his complex bookkeeping, and perhaps he didn't either. But at this moment, he felt he was fairly wealthy, with a wheat ranch in Montana and some 8 or 10 other pieces of endangered property. My mother hadn't lived to see much of this new prosperity. A delicate, highly intelligent woman, she had entered college at the age of 14 and graduated at the head of her class. She had accepted and married my father, for better or for worse, sharing more years of poverty than of comfort. She did the worrying for the family, and it was largely worry that killed her at 47. My father, who lived in an insulated dream world, took all of his losses philosophically, even the loss of my mother. On this summer day in 1918, he had no worries whatsoever, unless he briefly remembered that Herschel was fighting in the front lines of France. The price of leaf tobacco was soaring, as were the prices of other farm products, and land was selling at an all-time high. His cornfields were green and thriving, and his wheat and oats were promising a record yield to the acre. In lush pastures, through which small brooks wandered, his herds of Holstein and Guernsey cattle grazed contentedly in knee-deep grass and clover. I always enjoyed these farm excursions, particularly the opportunity to watch colts and calves high-tilling through the pastures. The young and almost every species, it seemed, were glad to be alive, Rascal included. Just now, however, my little raccoon was happily exhausted, sleeping off his overindulgence in turtle eggs. He lay on the back seat, his ringed tail coiled neatly over his face. He continued to sleep until first lamplight, when we were nearing our destination in search of whippoorwills. We had no time to visit the site of the cabin where my father had been born, or the big brick house on the same homestead where he had spent his boyhood. If we were to reach the Kumlean property, we must leave the car at this point and walk through meadowland along the old Milwaukee Trail, long since abandoned. Up this trail from Galena, Illinois, had once moved heavy ox carts pulled by 6 or 8 yoke of oxen. These toad crushers, bringing pigs of lead from the mines to the lake port, had wheels made of the cross-sections of giant white oak trees. The screaming of these wheels on their wooden axles could be heard for miles. Down the same trail from Milwaukee had come such early settlers as the Thuri Kumlean from Sweden and my ancestors from England. The ruts were now overgrown with grass and healed by the passage of time, but we could see them clearly as my father Rascal and I walked through the gathering dusk, accompanied only by the shadows of pioneers long dead, moving through fields and forests of memory. Above us circled the nighthawks, searching insects, their aerial acrobatics graceful and erratic. "Notice the ovals of white under each wing," my father said. "That is one of the few ways you can tell nighthawks from whippoorwills." "What other ways?" "The whippoorwill's call, of course, and his whiskers." "How can you get near enough to see a whippoorwill's whiskers?" "You seldom can," my father admitted, "but on those which Kumlean mounted, they were obvious enough. Stiff bristles on either side of the wide mouth, probably for sensing the flying insects he scoops up for food." We walked on in silence, approaching the 40 acres of virgin forest which Kumlean had protected from the axe. It is gone now, but it was there when I was a boy, a sanctuary and a memorial, haunted by the spirit of the gentle Swede who played his flute for the whippoorwills. We came at last to the flowing well which the old naturalist had dug. Ringed with heavy limestone slabs, its cold water gushed up from below and winding off in a little stream through marshy pastures to the lake. I was thirsty and went down on my knees to drink from the clear, deep pool, but my father said, "Wait a minute, Sterling, try this." From mint that Kumlean had once planted, my father plucked a few leaves, asked me to rub them between my fingers, and then taste them thoroughly. They were delightful and tangy, and when I drank from the well, I tasted water more cool and refreshing than any I had ever known. In the amber afterlight around the woodland spring, we all three drank. Then amid the ferns, we waited for my first whippoorwill. Very slowly, the full moon edged above the horizon until we could see its entire circumference. Rascal roamed a bit and caught and ate a cricket. but he still too well fed to be restless. He came back to me, chirring comfortably, and in his chirr were added other night sounds, the wings of big moths soft upon the air, the rustling of small creatures in the grass, meadow mice perhaps, and the chorus of the frogs in the marsh. Then it came, 3 pure syllables, 3 times repeated, whip-poor-will, 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 a soloist against the symphony of the night, making me feel weightless, airborne, and eerie, happy but also immeasurably sad. Again the whippoorwill called, and on the second invitation another whippoorwill answered courteously. For nearly half an hour they carried on their spirited duet. My small raccoon listened intently, well aware of the exact direction from which each call was coming. Having had his afternoon nap, he was now ready to make a night of it. The concert ended as abruptly as it had begun, and we awoke as from a dream. We scrambled up from the ferns, and by the light of the rising moon, turned westward down the old trail which had brought my people to this land of lakes and rivers.